Well, good afternoon. The subcommittee will come to order, and the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's subcommittee markup of 27 pieces of legislation to remove barriers to broadband deployment. The bills we are considering today will reduce or eliminate unnecessary restrictive permitting policies that threaten the success of the largest investment in broadband infrastructure this country has ever made. Said before, and I will say it again, the infrastructure law was a missed opportunity to enact meaningful permitting reform. Today, we have an opportunity to fix that mistake. While I'm happy that several of the bills before us are bipartisan, it is disheartening that my colleagues on this side of the aisle were unwilling to work with us on the remainder of the bills in this package. Our proposals make meaningful, common sense reforms to many permitting processes that are barriers to the broadband deployment. With the legislation we are considering today, we are acting to modernize broadband permitting in three important ways. First, streamlining state and local permitting processes. Second, reducing permitting barriers on federal property. And third, removing cumbersome environmental and historical review processes for broadband deployment in certain circumstances. Included in this markup is a bill I'm proud to lead, the Wireless Leadership Act. This bill places reasonable limitations on state and local governments for what fees they may charge and will prevent them from delaying application approvals. Specifically, it provides much-needed transparency into the application process for broadband providers, which helps in the effort to invest in new or upgraded infrastructure. These companies deserve a timely and predictable response to their applications. It would also impose clear shot clocks that would provide reasonable expectations for both applicants and local governments. Additionally, this legislation would address state and local governments that prohibit the deployment of broadband infrastructure or fail to act on an application. Applications that a state or local government fails to grant or deny within the time frame described in the bill would be deemed granted. In addition to my legislation, we will forward on to the full committee 18 bills that will speed up deployment of broadband to rural areas and streamline the network upgrade process, allowing faster broadband speeds for more Americans. Additionally, we're going to consider 8 bills that take steps to streamline the cumbersome requirements that deploy broadband on federal lands. These bills will fast-track deployment, encourage network upgrades, and simplify the historical and environmental review processes. The federal government has now dedicated billions of dollars to connect all Americans through a variety of programs. We've heard it time and time again, reforming and simplifying broadband permitting is the only way we can make this money go further and connect more Americans faster. Over the last several years, billions of dollars have been made available for state and local governments that can be used to increase staff to process applications, and we heard from witnesses that resources could be helpful. The resources are there and should be dedicated to process permits to avoid these issues. House Republicans aren't the only ones preaching this message. In fact, even the Biden administration's Notice of Funding Opportunity for the BEAD program requires states to identify actionable steps to reduce costs and barriers to deployment, promote the use of existing infrastructure, including expediting permitting timelines and waiving fees. The Biden-Harris Permitting Action Plan calls for many of the solutions we've put forward today. The goal of closing the digital divide cannot be accomplished without improving the permitting process, particularly on federal lands. Despite these recommendations, many of the bills being considered today do not have Democrat support, but we welcome your support as we move forward to full committee. Lastly, we will consider legislation to extend the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority. It is vitally important that we continue to push for a long-term Spectrum Auction Authority solution, and this legislation is a step in that direction. I want to thank all the members of the subcommittee for their work on these measures, and I also look forward to advancing them to full committee. And with that, I am going to yield back the balance of my time and recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from California, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bipartisan items on the agenda today will speed broadband deployment and help bring connectivity to communities without it. From the small hamlets in my district to the rest of the rural areas represented by members of this subcommittee, those bills represent an important step forward. I'm an original co-sponsor of the Digital Applications Act on the agenda today. This bill would take long overdue action to establish online portals to accept, process, and grant applications for broadband deployment. As we heard at the hearing on this bill, the current process for submitting and tracking the progress of applications is severely disjointed. As the Wireless Infrastructure Association noted at our hearing, measures that would direct federal agencies to develop online application portals have the potential to significantly expedite the permitting process. So I'm glad to see the Digital Applications Act moving forward. It'll provide much-needed clarity and accountability for broadband deployment on federal lands. But that's not the only bipartisan bill that will speed up broadband deployment. We have bills that will expedite evaluation, standardize fees, and speed up permitting. Representatives Palmer and Ryan's Standard Fees Act would establish a common fee for applications processing. Representatives Duncan and Craig's Expediting Federal Broadband Deployment Act would establish an interagency strike force to prioritize broadband deployment on federal lands. As we prepare for the distribution of BEAD funds, these bills will remove barriers and speed up deployments. But unfortunately, that's only part of the story. There are other bills on the agenda today that are partisan and counterproductive. They undermine local authority and limit rather than support local governments. Draconian shot clocks coupled with deemed grant provisions set up under-resourced local governments to fail. Instead of providing the resources our local partners need to meet demand, these bills limit their authority and restrict their processes. So, while I'm glad we're making bipartisan progress, the minority and many of our local governments are concerned about the partisan bills moving forward today. Despite that, I know there will be a continued need to focus on this issue. So I'm excited to have bipartisan bills to help close the digital divide, and I'm committed to moving them to the floor quickly. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that this subcommittee will be considering another short-term extension of the SCC's auction authority. As I said at our hearing the day after that authority lapsed, this was and continues to be a failure. Reinstating it is a national security and economic imperative. With companies like T-Mobile ready to put 2 gigahertz licenses to use, this rolling lapse is preventing companies from providing new broadband services to American consumers. And in the run-up to the World Radio Conference, it sends a dangerous message to the rest of the world about our ability to lead. So this extension is a step in the right direction, but without a willing partner in the Senate, it may not be enough. Nevertheless, I'm glad our subcommittee is moving forward. With that, I look forward to discussion of these bills, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you. The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The chair now recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlelady from Washington, the chair of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this important markup. High-speed broadband is a critical part of today's modern economy, yet some Americans still do not have reliable internet access. We need effective reforms to accelerate the build-out of high-speed internet, and the bills we are considering today will speed the deployment of broadband infrastructure and ensure that federal funding is promoting connectivity rather than becoming government waste. We're leading on proposals that take meaningful steps to reduce unnecessary barriers to broadband deployment. Many of our bills have strong bipartisan support, and I'm hopeful we will continue to garner more support for all these bills. My colleagues are committed to getting this job done. For the American people, it will mean better and faster internet access so that they can build a business, communicate with their loved ones, advance their education, improve the world around them, and so much more. The money is there. Congress has made the investment. Now we need to take the next step to roll back regulations to get reliable broadband to every American more quickly. These measures will ensure that we prioritize broadband to rural, unserved communities that need it most by making sure federal regulations don't prevent Americans from getting connected. Committee Republicans have introduced these proposals for the last 2 Congresses. And even the Biden administration has put out a permitting action plan to roll back permitting requirements to ensure effective use of the billions of dollars dedicated for infrastructure build-out. We'll hear more about many of these important solutions today that will ensure effective broadband deployment. And I'm pleased to be leading on the Wildfire Communications Resiliency Act, which streamlines the deployment of broadband projects to repair or replace communication facilities damaged by wildfires. In the aftermath of a wildfire, it can be vital, even life-saving, to be able to quickly restore communications networks, so those impacted by and responding to the fire can get the resources they need. This process should not be slowed down by cumbersome permitting issues and environmental reviews. This bill is just one of many good pieces of legislation up for review today. We're also considering legislation to extend the FCC's Spectrum Auction Authority, which expired in March for the first time ever. My goal is to continue working on a broader deal to extend the Spectrum Auction Authority longer term and provide certainty to the FCC and the communications industry. Fund important priorities like the Rip and Replace program and Next Generation 911, and work with my colleagues across the aisle and in the Senate to make this a bipartisan deal that gets signed into law. I want to thank the sponsors of these bills, both Republicans and Democrats, for their work. I'm hopeful that my colleagues across the aisle will consider working with us to make all of these solutions bipartisan. These bills will help unleash American innovation, deploy broadband across the country, and make America more secure. Let's keep working to move solutions through the regular order process. Thank you. I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Latta. This markup today, in my opinion, is a missed opportunity by the Republican majority. While I'm happy to support a small handful of bipartisan bills that improve certain processes at federal agencies that deal with broadband permitting, I'm disappointed to say that the major permitting bill would run roughshod over critical environmental and cultural protections. It's a partisan bill that will ultimately do nothing to ensure that the historic broadband investments Democrats delivered as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law reach all communities that need it. As this subcommittee heard at the legislative hearing just a few weeks ago, the biggest obstacle to permitting is a lack of resources at permitting agencies at the federal, state, and local level, which are responsible for processing siting applications. The witness panel delivered that message loud and clear, even as the majority denied us a second Democratic witness and stacked the panel in a departure from committee precedent. Democrats addressed the resources issue for federal agencies last year with passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. That law, which was opposed by every Republican on this committee, appropriated money to the relevant agencies to speed up environmental reviews, and it's already proving to be effective in accelerating those processes for large environmental projects. Unfortunately, one bill that would address this issue for local governments, Representative Fletcher's Broadband Incentives for Communities Act, is not on this markup today because we were unable to reach agreement on a solution that provides the resources that local governments need and will continue to lack for this very purpose. Instead of solving that problem today, we will consider an AINS that throws together almost 24 partisan bills that have no chance of becoming law. Many of these bills would exempt communications infrastructure from environmental and historic preservation requirements, when in reality, most of those projects do not require those approvals. And whether or not these requirements exist, there will still be a bottleneck at permit offices if there's not enough qualified employees at the agencies to review and approve the applications. To make matters worse, another set of these partisan bills would severely weaken the authority of local governments to steer investment and deployments in their own communities. And this kind of deregulation and preemption of local authority is one reason the digital divide has grown to be as pervasive as it is today. We simply can't continue to make it easier for communications providers to cherry pick the areas they want to serve, and more importantly, to avoid investing in the areas they don't. These communities tend to be overwhelmingly low income, rural, and communities of color. When providers turn their backs on these communities, they are denying the people there the tremendous opportunities that modern communications infrastructure provides: educational opportunities, advanced medical services, job training, and much more. It's disappointing that my Republican colleagues have not learned these lessons and have instead chosen to forge a partisan path on legislation that would only exacerbate the problem. I would also point out that in their Default of America bill, the majority would make severe cuts to federal agency budgets, and they would also claw back the money that state and local governments received during COVID. So at the same time they are demanding more of these permitting agencies, they're cutting their resources, and it makes no sense. Whenever my Republican colleagues are ready to work in a productive way on targeted solution, Democratic members are ready and eager to have these discussions. Now, finally, I'd like to mention Chair Rogers' spectrum bill that we'll consider today. We must renew the Federal Communications Commission's auction authority for the long term. We must also restore the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's place as the clear manager of federal spectrum and ensure that the proceeds from future auctions be used to fund important projects that benefit the public. The bill before us today is a short-term bill, but Chair Rogers and I will continue to work on these issues together and with our Senate colleagues. I look forward to soon passing a comprehensive package. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair reminds members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Are there further opening statements? Hearing none. The chair calls up H.R. 3309 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3309, to amend the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 to establish a uniform fee schedule.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point so ordered. Does anyone seek to be recognized on the bill? Okay. Last call. Does anybody wish to be recognized on the bill? Well, hearing none. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Hearing none. Are there any other amendments? The question now occurs on the forwarding H.R. 3309 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, nay. Aye. Aye. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Chair calls up H.R. 3293 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3293, to require the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information to establish an interagency strike force to
Without
ensure that
objection,
certain...
the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. Does anyone seek recognition on the bill? Are there any, pardon me, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question now occurs in forwarding H.R. 3293 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. The chair, pardon me, the chair calls up H.R. 3299 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3299, to require the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture to establish online portals to accept, process, and dispose of certain Form 299s.
Without
and for
objection,
other
the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point so ordered. Does anyone seek to be recognized on the bill? Gentlelady, what does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I'm
Gentlelady
glad.
recognized.
Thank you. I am glad we are considering the Digital Applications Act today, and I want to thank my colleagues from California and the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mrs. Matsui, for her leadership in this bill. This bill is common sense, simply requiring that the Department of the Interior and the Department of Agriculture establish an online portal for acceptance, processing, and disposal of standard forms 299 for communication use authorizations. This bill would help close the digital divide by providing transparency and predictability into the process, making it easier to track these common form applications to deploy communication facilities on federal lands. During our last legislative hearing in this subcommittee, we heard from all of our witnesses about how this common sense bipartisan piece of legislation would improve the deployment of broadband across federal lands. I'd like to thank Chairman Latta for his leadership in bringing up this package of broadband permitting reform bills. And as we all know, these bills are critical to close the digital divide and deploy broadband quickly and efficiently across the country. I'd also like to thank Representative Matsui for partnering with me on this bill, and thanks again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this markup. I urge all members to support this common sense piece of legislation and support the Digital Applications Act. I yield.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments? Hearing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3299 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair calls up H.R. 3283 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3283, to require the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information to report to Congress on any barriers to establishing online
Without objection,
portals.
the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. Does anyone seek recognition on the bill? The gentlelady from Michigan is recognized. What does the gentlelady wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized, strike the last word, and is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In previous hearings on this committee, we've heard from experts that several agencies are not properly equipped and prepared to quickly process the increase in permitting applications resulting from the once-in-a-generation investments made in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Investments that will bring broadband access to every community across our country. We need legislation to allow faster, more accurate disposal of permitting applications for communications and utility infrastructure to help us get these important projects underway and reach the people who need them the most. That is why Congresswoman Miller Meeks and I introduced the Facilitating Digital Applications Act. This legislation, in coordination with the Digital Applications Act led by Reps. Kamick and Matsui, will ensure that the Department of Interior and the Department of Agriculture have established an online portal for applications to deploy communications and other utility infrastructure on federal property. The bill requires the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to report to Congress every 60 days on the status of this application portal, expediting the swift deployment of this portal. These departments to date do not provide an online application for Form 299 requests. An online portal option will assist these agencies with managing the increased number of applications, maximizing the benefits of these important programs. This legislation is a good governance approach that will provide certainty and ease of access to industry while preserving critical protections. The bill ensures that we are continuing to thoughtfully modernize permitting applications in a bipartisan manner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including this bill as part of today's markup. I would like to thank Representatives Kamick and Matsui for their work supporting the effective and efficient delivery of these programs, and Representative Miller Meeks for working with me on this important bipartisan legislation, and I urge all of my colleagues to support the underlying bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition on the bill? Hearing none, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3283 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair now calls up H.R. 3343 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3343, to require the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information to submit to Congress a plan for
Without
the
objection, the
Assistant-
first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point so ordered. Does anyone seek to be recognized on the bill? Hearing none. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there? Oh, I thought he raised his hand. Okay. Are there any other amendments to the bill? Oh, I'm sorry. The gentleman from Florida is recognized. Why does the gentleman seek recognition?
To strike the last word?
The gentleman is recognized to strike the last word, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Proud to be able to co-introduce HR 3343 with my dear friend, Mr. Pfluger. We know with the Federal Broadband Deployment Tracking Act, it's going to help us be more efficient and ask the NTIA to submit a plan to Congress on tracking, acceptance, processing, and disposal of requests for communication uses for authorization on federal property, something that with Florida, Texas, and especially out west, so many different lands owned by the federal government, this is key to help get this through. I just went down to area of the district, cattle country, Kenansville, just south of where I live in Kissimmee, and we see firsthand the investment in rural broadband finally getting to our ranchers and our growers, thanks to the American Rescue Plan, to the infrastructure law, and so making sure we can help streamline this process is absolutely critical for our constituents and others across the nation. And I yield back.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Again, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments to the legislation? Hearing none. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3343 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. The chair calls up H.R. 3345 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3345, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to extend the authority of the Federal Communications Commission.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Does anyone seek to be recognized on the bill? The full committee chair will be here momentarily, and so she would like to speak on the legislation. Again, is there anyone else wishing to seek recognition on the bill? We'll just hold temporarily. For what purpose is the gentlelady, the full committee chair from Washington, seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As both Ranking Member Pallone and I have stated, our goal is to reauthorize the FCC's auction authority, restore NTIA's role as federal spectrum manager, and fund important telecommunications programs, including rip and replace, with auction proceeds. When this bill moves to the full committee, my goal is to amend it to reflect all of this and extend Spectrum Auction Authority for enough time for us to develop a spectrum pipeline. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle as we develop a deal to amend this placeholder at the full committee. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition on the bill? Are there any bipartisan amendments on the bill? Are there any amendments to the legislation? Hearing none. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 33. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. The gentlelady from the 16th District of California.
Very good,
is
Mr. Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our wonderful ranking member. I wanted to say a few words about where we find ourselves right now relative to spectrum and an auction authority. First of all, the federal government has benefited enormously from the results of auctions. We know that spectrum, and we've dealt with it for decades here, that spectrum is the gold. It's not only 14 karat, it's 18 karat gold. It's the most valuable gold. And that's why companies pursue it. And they have that opportunity through making bids at the auctions when there's some spectrum available. Now, we know that T-Mobile took advantage of that auction and put up hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, and they've gotten zero. They've gotten zero. Now, if any of us don't pay our federal taxes, what happens to us? We have to pay some kind of fine for not giving them the money. Here in this situation, the government's taken the money and the stakeholder gets zero. But notch it up from there. This is a national security issue. If spectrum is not handled wisely in our country, it's not only a national security issue, it's an issue relative to competitiveness. So I welcome what the subcommittee is doing. I welcome what the subcommittee is doing. Something has failed somewhere. I just have a sense that, I don't know, the right people haven't sat down with the DOD, and I mean, I've dealt with this issue before, and we had to bring them in to make sure that they were right there with us. But having said all of this, I really wanted to highlight it with some remarks because it's serious. This is really serious. This has never happened before. This has never happened before. And I've weighed in with the Federal Communications Commission. I mean, it's a mess right now. That's the way I would categorize it. And so I welcome what we're doing. I hope that it sends a strong signal to all of the stakeholders how serious this is and that we get back to, I know the term regular order doesn't sound very sexy, but in this case, I really welcome it. So I thank the leadership of the committee, all of the members, and that's what I wanted to say about it. I'm really disturbed about this thing, and there doesn't seem to be any coming together anywhere. There's just whomever wanted to throw the sand in the gears, they were successful, but that's not an answer, and it's not good for our country. It's bad for our country. So I don't expect that they read my remarks in the record and they'll be so moved to get off their duffs. But I sure welcome the opportunity to get this off my chest. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank the gentlelady and for yielding back, and you never know, they might read those words, and we have to get some movement on this. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question now occurs on forwarding HR 3345 to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair now calls up HR 3291 and asks the clerk to report.
HR 3291, to provide that eligible facilities request under Section 6409A of the Middle Class Tax Relief and
Without
Job
objection,
Creation
the
Act.
first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point so ordered. Does anyone seek to be recognized on the bill? Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? For what does the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Georgia, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry. And would the clerk report the amendment, please?
Can the member please specify the amendment?
I'm sorry?
Can you please specify the amendment, the identifier?
Manager's amendment to H.R. 3291?
Ains_01?
Yes.
Thank you. Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3291, offered by Mr. Carter of Georgia. Strike all after the enacting clause.
Without
and insert the
objection,
following.
the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the amendment will be open at this time, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues for their work to lead on different solutions to lower barriers and streamline the process for deploying broadband to all Americans. This amendment includes several provisions authored by my Republican colleagues addressing everything from duplicative or unnecessary environmental reviews, limiting unnecessary application fees, and providing certainty on the timelines for reviewing permitting requests. At our legislative hearing, we heard from experts about the missed opportunities in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to address broadband permitting barriers. While the Senate did not take action on these important issues, today we are taking the first step to unleash innovation and turbocharge public and private investment. First, my amendment would streamline the process for requesting approvals to deploy new broadband infrastructure, including wireless towers or structures, fixed broadband and fiber optic cables, and cable service provider requests. The amendment would require that application fees to review permitting applications are based on actual and direct costs, that providers receive a response within a reasonable amount of time, and that there are clear rules of the road for when these time frames begin and end. And in cases where a broadband provider thinks they were wrongfully denied the ability to provide service, they can receive relief so that they can focus their time and energy on what matters most, connecting all Americans. Second, my amendment will streamline the process for requesting approval to upgrade existing infrastructure, including adding 5G to existing 4G towers, upgrading old copper lines to fiber, or deploying Open RAN compatible technologies that will help trusted equipment vendors develop an alternative to Chinese vendors like Huawei and ZTE. These changes will help limit the environmental impact of needing new infrastructure by encouraging providers to upgrade facilities in areas that have already undergone an environmental or historic preservation review. Finally, my amendment will ensure that environmental reviews for broadband deployments are proportional to the level of deployment taking place. In cases where broadband providers are simply upgrading infrastructure and rights-of-way that have already been disturbed by other communications or electric utility infrastructure, an environmental review has already been undertaken and the land has already been disturbed. My amendment would remove the requirement to undergo these reviews where broadband infrastructure is being deployed entirely in an area for which a review has already been conducted and infrastructure already exists. This includes waiving the environmental review to replace Huawei equipment that is eligible for reimbursement under the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act. This straightforward reform will remove a key barrier to broadband deployment, especially on federal lands where reviews can take more than 2 years. This amendment combines legislation led by every one of my Republican colleagues on this committee, and I would like to thank them for their thoughtful proposals to bring affordable broadband to their communities quickly and ensure that taxpayers' dollars are not wasted on more red tape. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Are there any other members seeking recognition? On the amendment, on the Ains? I'm sorry? Okay. The gentleman from California, what does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike last word.
The gentleman is recognized to strike the last word for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. This bill, in the amendment form, includes my bill, which is H.R. 3340, the Granted Act. I represent an extremely rural part of the country, and one of the largest challenges that my constituents face is access to broadband internet. This is a vital resource for them in areas such as education and the conduct of business and employment. Unfortunately, we're often hampered in our efforts to get broadband into my rural communities because over 80% of the landmass of my district is in public ownership. And deploying broadband infrastructure across those lands requires an onerous permitting process, most often involving the federal government. Several years ago, we directed the government to implement an expedited permitting process that put a maximum of 270 days on the time required to issue a permit if all of the other requirements of the permit had been met. But unfortunately, quite often we are finding that the federal government takes more than that 270 days, in fact, sometimes substantially more. This bill enacts a very simple fix to that very difficult problem by deeming approval of any permit for broadband infrastructure across public lands that has not been responded to within 270 days of when the application was completed. This bill would make a meaningful improvement in the quality of life of the people that I represent by giving them access to the broadband infrastructure that they lack. I'd like to thank my friend and colleague from Georgia for including this in the ANS, and I urge its adoption. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the Ames? The gentlelady from California, 16th District, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Right,
Chairman.
the last word.
Thank you. Before coming to Congress, I served for 10 years on the San Mateo County, California Board of Supervisors. And to this day, I have a deep appreciation for local government. Academicians, political leaders from both parties, industry, public interest groups, they all agree that universal, high-speed internet is necessary for our country's competitiveness in the 21st century. Every single member of this committee has uttered these words a multiplicity of times. The pandemic made this even more evident as so many transitioned to teleworking, with schools operating through distance learning, doctors' visits via telehealth. 24 million Americans lack internet access today, and it's a problem that's most acute in rural and tribal communities. And this number is just those who lack access. Millions more simply can't afford it. Now, last Congress, the Democrats made a generational investment to bridge the digital divide and bring reliable, high-speed internet to every American household. 82 billion, billion for broadband affordability, equity, and deployment. I, to this day, really can't understand why my Republican colleagues didn't support that. I think you have a great gig because you vote no and grab the dough. One of the most promising solutions to closing the digital divide, I think, comes from local governments. Over 900 counties, cities, municipal utilities, co-ops, neighborhood associations, and tribes are taking the digital divide problem into their own hands by building their own broadband networks. Community broadband systems expand internet access to unserved and underserved areas, and they encourage competition across the country. The very things that we constantly are calling for. These locally owned networks are effective. In a 2019 report, New America's Open Technology Institute called these networks, quote, the fast, affordable internet option that's flying under the radar, end of quote. Unfortunately, 19 states have enacted protectionist laws that restrict, and in some cases banned, community networks. This is really unacceptable protectionism that protects incumbent service providers from competition. So to solve this problem, I introduced the Community Broadband Act, which simply prohibits state laws that ban or restrict community broadband. I'm pleased that the subcommittee considered my bill during a legislative hearing on April 19th, but unfortunately, the majority didn't include it in today's markup. And when I say unfortunately, I have access, so it's not me. It's about our constituents. I think it's unfortunate not only for mine, but for yours as well. So this legislative hearing and today's markup are supposedly efforts to expedite broadband deployment. I mean, why not let a local, allow a local jurisdiction to set one up if they so choose? This would really improve the access and the affordability issues. And by, I think, ignoring this, we're really guaranteeing that that those options are just really off the table. Sorry, communities, local communities, you're off the table. You can't do this. Congress doesn't find you, I don't know, fitting, worthy, smart enough. I don't know what it is, but there has to be some kind of bias in this to not allow them. So obviously, I'm disappointed that it's not being taken up. But my larger disappointment is that that an opportunity is really, it's a lost opportunity, and that's the real loss for our collective, for communities across the country. So thank you for recognizing me, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah for 5 minutes to speak on the Ains.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually need to just share a few thoughts. I appreciate the gentlewoman's comments about municipal broadband, and I share a perspective of a former mayor who inherited a municipal broadband network in my city. And I would like to just push back on some of the statements that have been made and bring up 3 points. Municipalities and government entities have 3 problems when it comes to municipal broadband. One is risk. Taxpayers don't expect us to take on risk with their tax dollars. In a broadband network, those municipalities that have tried it will clearly point out there's a high amount of risk there. The second thing I'd like to bring up that's problematic for municipalities is the pace of change. We had a public utility, and technology didn't change for decades and decades and decades. Yet in our broadband network, we found every few years it required a brand new investment in upgraded equipment that exceeded the amount of the initial investment. Third thing is the level of expertise. There's not in most cities the level of expertise required to run a broadband network. Our network ultimately failed, and the city was left with a $60 million bond that we were unable to pay, and ended up having to cover the cost of that. And when, in the end, we brought in an outside provider to take over that network. And with that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the chair, Kathy McMorris-Rogers.
I appreciate the gentleman yielding. With this package of bills, the Republicans are offering solutions to streamline broadband permitting processes to improve Americans' access to faster, more reliable broadband services. And this amendment includes measures to ensure that hundreds of billions of dollars are used for broadband deployment, not more red tape. And I'm disappointed, I'm still hopeful though, that the Democrats will come and continue to work with us to make this amendment bipartisan. We're gonna keep working on that. President Biden's Deputy Secretary of Commerce highlighted permitting as one of the main issues preventing broadband deployment. NTIA, the agency administering the records amounts of broadband funding asked states to cap their fees and streamline their permitting requirements. This amendment would enforce those same exact requirements. ENC Republicans are leading to ensure that broadband is deployed quickly. Our nation's networks, where available, withstood the ultimate test during COVID-19 when Americans' lives moved fully online overnight. And this was largely due to America's light touch regulatory framework that has enabled innovation and investment in our networks and allowed them to adapt when challenged with increased demands, like a shift to telework. But the COVID-19 pandemic also highlighted the breadth of the digital divide and further emphasized the need to close that gap. Broadband permitting barriers stand between a future where everyone is connected and one where rural America is once again left behind. While everyone seems to recognize the value of broadband access, the federal government remains inefficient and unprepared for the scale of deployment as envisioned by NTIA's BEAD program. Many environmental reviews are either duplicative or disproportionate to the scale of the undertaking, unnecessarily delaying broadband infrastructure deployment. These challenges are especially acute in places like Eastern Washington that I represent and other parts of the Western United States where large swaths of land are federally managed. At our legislative hearing, we heard witness testimony that roughly 10 to 15% of the cost of broadband deployment is related to regulatory fees, including permitting costs. We heard about inefficient, outdated processes that are not working as intended, and concerns that broken processes will be magnified under the stress of billions in government subsidies. With hundreds of billions in taxpayer dollars available for broadband deployment, these permitting costs could result in resources being wasted, whether it's fees that are not based on actual or direct costs needed to process the application, a duplicate or unnecessary environmental rule, a delay by a federal agency to approve a project. We need to enforce agency accountability, lift the regulatory burdens to foster a light touch regulatory environment. This amendment will lower the cost to deploy broadband service. It will reduce the time to deploy new and upgraded existing broadband infrastructure, and is going to remove barriers to private investment that will turbocharge the public dollars. So let's keep working on this. Let's keep working to ensure that the over $42 billion actually gets all Americans connected. I yield back.
And the gentleman yields back, and the gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there any other members seeking recognition on the Ains? The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes to speak. Strike the last word on the Ains.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Briefly, I want to offer support for the package of permitting bills before us today, including H.R. 3288, the Broadband Competition and Efficient Deployment Act. It's incumbent upon us to ensure that Americans have access to reliable, high-speed internet in order to work, to learn, and to heal from home. Unfortunately, building out broadband infrastructure in rural communities has been bogged down by bureaucracy, leading to unnecessary waste while our constituents and communities pay the price. It is imperative that we make sensible reforms that cut red tape and enhance the permitting process. Despite record amounts of funding over the past several years, recently passed legislation, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, has failed to implement needed fix to the burdensome permitting process. Only after making these necessary adjustments can we begin the build-out for this crucial infrastructure and bridge the digital divide that impacts so many Americans, especially those in rural areas like my district, Pennsylvania 13. Therefore, I urge all of my colleagues to vote yes and adopt the package of bills, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the Ains? The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the Ains.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
The amendment in the nature of a substitute includes my legislation, H.R. 3292, the Brownfields Broadband Deployment Act. The EPA's Brownfields program is very important for the state of Michigan, and more specifically, the district I represent. Because of Michigan's rich manufacturing history, there are a number of former industrial sites that are ripe for revitalization. Revitalizing these areas encourages economic development, injects new tax revenue into the local economy, and assists local governments with the support they need to address these projects. But today, revitalization can't reach its full potential without connection. And due to onerous regulations for broadband deployment on brownfield sites, those connections are too often delayed. The legislation will help streamline the deployment of broadband projects entirely within brownfield sites by eliminating the requirement to prepare duplicative environmental or historic preservation reviews. These sites are often located in digitally underserved areas, and the proposed changes will help promote greater digital connectivity. Beyond my legislation, the AINS we are considering today includes much-needed permitting reforms. We need to get rural America connected. The internet is no longer a luxury, and constituents like mine in rural areas need broadband so their children can do their homework, they can reach their doctors, and can stay connected to family and friends. Getting all Americans connected is a difficult task on its own that will take time. But on top of that, broadband providers are subject to significant permitting delays at both the local and the federal level. Inconsistent application portals and high fees only add to these problems. To get broadband to truly underserved, we must streamline our permitting processes. Bureaucratic red tape should not be the reason rural Michiganders don't have the internet. I encourage my colleagues to support the AINS and the underlying legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the AINS? For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you. Several parts of my district lie within flood zones. At the same time, one of the top concerns of my residents is obtaining and maintaining access to reliable internet and cell phone services. I want to be sure that all of my constituents have access to 21st century technologies, enabling them to harness the power that these capabilities offer. Being left behind is not an option. The Coastal Broadband Deployment Act will remove burdensome and unnecessary regulatory steps that only serve to add months to communications projects that will make facilities more resilient to floods, hurricanes, and other storms that threaten to hinder communications in an emergency. This bill will promote safety, will ensure that flood-prone areas are not delayed in 5G rollout, and will ensure that my community and communities like mine get the latest technology that define our modern world. So with that, if anyone wants my time, otherwise I will yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there other members seeking recognition to speak on the AINS? The gentleman from Ohio seeks recognition. What does the gentleman seek recognition for?
To speak on the bill, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this important markup today with the massive infusion of federal broadband dollars about to hit states. It is crucial that we do our job in this committee and pave the way for broadband providers to build out our networks quickly and minimize unnecessary red tape. The bills included in this amendment present a great opportunity to ensure that not only my constituents throughout central and southeast Ohio are being connected quickly, but that all Americans will be too. Cable companies in Ohio and across the nation are leading the way in building out new broadband networks throughout rural America, be it through the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or soon the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. I was happy to see that my bill, the Cable Leadership Act, is included in this amendment. My bill is simple. It puts a 120-day shot clock on cable franchising authorities to grant or deny a new cable franchise when an operator wants to move into a new community. These operators want to serve new homes and businesses. We can't let them be bogged down with countless applications and approvals. We need to ensure that we keep the process moving so the networks can be built out. This package of bills does just that. I appreciate the chairman moving this package forward here today, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak recognition on the Ains? Hearing none. I beg your pardon? You want to, the gentleman has an amendment on the Ains? The gentleman has
I have an amendment at the desk. Amend TDI. 1.
The clerk will
I mean
report.
TD1, yeah.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3291 offered by Mr. Pallone. Page 12, strike line 25, and all that follows.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the amendment is open at this point. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Latta. My amendment aims to ensure permitting agencies at the federal, state, and local levels retain the authority to make decisions that best suit the needs of our communities and the public. No matter where you go in this country, if you want to do any type of construction, you must first get relevant approvals from local government. Whether you're building a house or school, putting up utility poles, or digging a trench to lay fiber optic cable, the local government has an important role to play, primarily to ensure the health and safety of the community. And that's why I'm troubled by provisions like those that my Republican colleagues are so fervently pursuing to enact narrow and arbitrary timeframes to approve or deny applications, and then say permission granted if a decision has been made by that time. In other words, if a municipal zoning board or planning board is reviewing an application and does not issue an approval by a deadline set by House Republicans, the applicant's proposal would automatically be considered approved without any further input from the community. And I'm most concerned that this approach raises more questions than answers, especially when it comes to liability in the case of accidents. Now, my colleagues like to demonize local governments, that's my Republican colleagues, like to demonize local governments for not approving applications as quickly as they would like. But anyone who's served at the local level, and I have, knows there is a lot more to these decisions than a simple yes or no. No one thinks about who's responsible for ensuring there is ample police or fire department personnel for traffic duty to ensure the safety of the workers and public during construction, or the complexity of stacking or staggering certain construction projects to avoid disruptions or delays that can often and do occur as a result. It's the mayors and councils and planning boards and zoning boards who are responsible for these considerations, and they're on the hook if anything goes wrong or someone gets hurt. Now, I understand that my Republicans don't think that that's their problem, but those of us that work closely with our mayors and councils know that they are as eager as anyone to have high-speed broadband access in their communities. What possible advantage would come from deliberately ignoring or delaying requests to improve services for their constituents? So these provisions can put people at risk. If you don't believe me, I challenge each of my colleagues to tell their mayors about this bill and these provisions the next time they go home. I know that I wouldn't want to tell them that I voted for this. So I guess what the Republican majority is trying to do is to use these provisions to force permitting agencies to work faster to avoid automatic grant of permission. But as I said in my opening statement, the majority is demanding more and more of all these agencies while at the same time defunding them. So again, I don't want to just beat you up too much, but I mean, the bottom line is you can't expect that all these things are done quickly without there being problems. And I know when I go home at weekends, I see all kinds of construction all over. And I mean, it's not easy to make sure that you have the police and who are we to be telling the local planning boards and zoning boards what to do? We don't spend the time reviewing these things and looking into the details of it. So we should be the ones telling them what to do because they're the ones that actually have to look at this and figure out what's the best way to handle it. So to me, it's pretty bad that you just think it's okay to ride roughshod all over all the local officials and planning boards and everybody and just do what you think is necessary. So I encourage all of my colleagues to stand with their local governments by supporting this amendment, just from a practical point of view. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there any members wishing to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Georgia.
I move to strike the
recognized.
last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
With 42 billion ready to go out the door for broadband deployment, we have to provide accountability on agencies and certainty to providers whether or not they will get their permits approved. Delays in the permitting process have the potential to ruin the success of connecting all Americans, and we cannot risk more money wasted. Here, the Democrats are trying to strike deemed grant remedies created in this bill to ensure that state and local governments act within their review times. What's interesting is that some of the deemed grant remedies that they are trying to strike were first enacted by the Democrats. Deemed grant remedies are not new. One already exists when state and local governments fail to act on an eligible facilities request within 60 days. This was enacted in a bipartisan rulemaking implemented by a Democratic FCC. The then FCC Commissioner Rosenworcel and Chairman Wheeler both praised the rules as balancing the need to streamline the permitting process for the next generation of wireless technology while preserving state and local authority. Commissioner Rosenworcel, speaking about the FCC's order, that because the rules we put in place today are first steps to encourage deployment of infrastructure, that is absolutely critical for the next generation of wireless service, 5G. Chairman Wheeler, speaking about the FCC's order, high-speed mobile broadband also requires high-speed mobile build-out. However, the regulatory burdens associated with deployments can be expensive and time-consuming. This order takes concrete steps to immediately and substantially ease those burdens. Mr. Carter's amendment applies the same reasoning to other requests to deploy new fixed and mobile communications infrastructure. Mr. Carter's amendment also broadens the deemed grants to apply to federal agency, which is necessary in order to ensure that the timeline requirements in the infrastructure law are met and the billions of dollars ready to be spent on deployment are not wasted. For that reason, I will oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there others wishing to speak on the gentleman's amendment to the Ains? Hearing none, is there any further discussion? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. The gentleman requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Bilirakis. Bilirakis votes aye. Wahlberg.
The gentleman wishes to be recognized.
Bilirakis is off aye on no. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes no. Carter. Carter votes no. Dunn. Curtis. Curtis votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Weber votes no. Allen.
Allen votes no.
Allen votes no. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes no. Kamick. Kamick votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Latta.
No.
Latta votes no. Matsui.
Aye.
Matsui votes aye. Clark. Clark votes aye. Vesey. Vesey votes aye. Soto. Soto votes aye. Eshu. Eshu votes aye. Cardenas. Cardenas votes aye. Craig. Craig votes aye. Fletcher. Fletcher votes aye. Dingell. Dingell votes aye. Custer. Custer votes aye. Kelly. Kelly votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye.
How's the gentleman from Florida recorded?
Mr. Dunn is not recorded. Dunn votes no.
Are there any other members wishing to record their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will report the result.
Chair Latta, on that vote, we have 12 ayes and 16 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? The gentleman from California seeks recognition. Why does the gentleman seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, amendment TD1.
The clerk will report the
I'm
amendment.
sorry, TD3, I'm sorry, we just did TD1, TD3.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3291, offered by Mr. Cardenas. Page 48, after line 3.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity to provide this amendment. As Ranking Member Pallone just pointed out, the AINS before us puts a lot of restrictions and requirements on state and local governments to crunch permit applications by deadlines set by my Republican colleagues. My amendment does not speak to those requirements, but rather would authorize resources for state and local offices to carry out the federal mandates proposed by some of the members of this subcommittee. At our hearing last month, witnesses spoke at length about how a lack of qualified personnel and financial resources at offices reviewing applications can cause delays in getting projects approved. I fundamentally disagree with the idea that local officials are somehow unwilling or unmotivated to approve projects, to deploy or improve communications infrastructure in their local communities. The arbitrary timelines laid out by my colleagues are unlikely to make a real difference in deploying broadband and wireless infrastructure any faster. My amendment, however, would help speed up permit reviews and get more projects approved in less time by providing state and local governments with the resources they need to handle the influx of applications that we know are coming. We should be treating local governments as our partners in these efforts, not our opponents. And also, let's come together and take meaningful action to break down these deployment barriers. I think it's important to understand that I'm a little confused today because a lot of times my Republican colleagues say that Washington should not dictate what happens locally, that we have local officials and local appointed officials that are actually responsible for what goes on in their local communities. I know when I was a city councilman in Los Angeles, anytime we were improving our streets or what have you, we got complaints saying, who the heck is making it harder for me to get to work? Why is it that those barriers make me go in a different direction, et cetera? That's why local officials are there, so that they can know exactly what's going on the ground, plan it properly, but all of that takes resources. Sometimes it does take more time. But then again, my amendment says, you know what? Let's help them do their job well and do it quickly, providing some of the resources should this federal mandate actually become law. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Well, thank you very much. The gentleman yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendments? The gentleman from Utah seeks recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's request to speak, to strike the last word, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. At the risk of my colleagues on this committee getting tired of hearing the fact that I'm a former mayor, as a former mayor, I'd like to weigh in. And not only a former mayor, but a mayor who had broadband deployed throughout his city to every single home and every single residence. And I might just brag for a minute as well. The city of Provo offered internet to every single resident at no cost. And they did that not through municipal broadband, but by bringing in an outside provider. I do want to point out that state and local governments have never had more money from the federal government, and specifically to deploy local broadband. Since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, state and local governments across the country have received hundreds of millions of billions of dollars. The vast majority of state and local governments are, I think, as those that we're talking about today, do a great job in processing these permits in a timely manner, and they don't issue the permits in a way to extract revenue from broadband providers, but rather as a necessary cost of providing that service. Under our bill, state and local governments would retain the ability to charge fees for reviewing permitting applications. The only difference is that we would require those fees be based on actual and direct cost, and they'd have to be transparent with those costs. This means that a local government can't just jack up the cost to pay for other improvements in their city, which happens often in local government. It means that they can't use revenue for excessive fees to subsidize other parts of the government. I oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back my time.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there other?
Sure, if I still have my time on.
The gentlelady seeks the gentleman's time, and he yields to the gentlelady.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Mr. Curtis, you are such a lovely man, you really are.
I hear a butt coming.
Yeah, you do. I know, you get it. But you are lovely. You're a lovely man. You're a gentleman. This whole issue of local jurisdictions and the discussion that we're having as we move through this markup, I have to tell you, it's a real rub for me. You know, what works in one community maybe won't work in another, but just because there's a project or an effort that for whatever reason has failed in a community and the entire nation has to bear the burden of that failure, I don't think that's fair. So while I certainly, if I have community broadband efforts in my congressional district, I would certainly say to them, look into the one in Utah and see what went wrong there so that mistakes are not made here. But to hold all of these local jurisdictions hostage over something that didn't go right in another, I just feel very uncomfortable. So those are my
May I reclaim my
uncomfortable
time?
words to a lovely man. I yield
Well,
back.
to a lovely co-companion who I also admire and respect, just a couple of thoughts. I also served on American Public Power's National Policy Board, where we saw dozens and perhaps hundreds of cities also try the same thing. And I also have other cities in Utah who have tried the same thing. So it doesn't come lightly and doesn't come just as one city. And I actually would really welcome additional dialogue with you about this, and may take you up on this comment sometimes that we shouldn't apply a one-size-fits-all from Washington. I think that actually applies in quite a few situations, and I think those are wise words. Would love to have further discussion with you about how to move forward. Thank you. I yield my time.
I thank the gentleman. He yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the gentleman from California's amendment? Hearing none. It's been requested for a roll call vote. The clerks will call the roll. All those will signify saying aye, and those opposed, nay.
Bilirakis. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes no. Carter. Carter votes no. Dunn. Dunn votes no. Curtis. Curtis votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Weber votes no. Allen. Allen votes no. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Fluger. Fluger votes no. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes no. Kamick. Kamick votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Latta. Latta votes no. Matsui. Matsui votes aye. Clark. Clark votes aye. Vesey. Vesey votes aye. Soto. Soto votes aye. Eshu. Eshu votes aye. Cardenas. Cardenas votes aye. Craig. Craig votes aye. Fletcher. Fletcher votes aye. Dingell. Dingell votes aye. Custer. Custer votes aye. Kelly. Kelly votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis is not recorded. Bilirakis votes no.
Are there any other members wishing to cast their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will take the roll.
Chair Latta, on that vote, we have 12 ayes and 16 noes.
Thank you very much. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? To the Ains? Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. My amendment is titled DSC Amendment 4.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3291 offered by Mr. Vesey. Strike Section 402.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many of my Republican colleagues have expressed a desire to tackle these permitting issues close to the digital divide and get broadband funding out of the door to our states quickly and efficiently. But there is one section in this majority aims that I fear would have the opposite effect and potentially prevent many states from getting any BEAD funding at all. And my amendment would strike Section 402 of the amendment in the nature of a substitute language previously introduced as BEAD Fees Act. Far from getting funding out in a quick and efficient way, that language would actually prohibit NTIA from giving BEAD funding to any state unless the state's legislature has enacted legislation that spells out all of the requirements of this section. You heard that right. Any state across the country with a fee structure that doesn't match up exactly with what the majority is proposing in this section wouldn't get another dime of BEAD funding. Indeed, NTIA would be prohibited by this law from sending those states the funds allocated to them. In my home state of Texas, for instance, the state legislature only has a few more days until they sine die, and they won't begin a session again until January 2025. And so if the majority's provision is enacted, it would mean that Texas would have to stand by and watch while other states' broadband projects are funded. I'm not willing to jeopardize the millions or potentially billions of dollars that our state is set to receive, and I'm surprised that the majority wants to risk their states from receiving these funds. It certainly injects a lot of uncertainty into this historic funding opportunity. It doesn't mention a process for proving such legislation is on the books, or what happens if a state thinks that the requirements have been met, but the Assistant Secretary does not. I'd urge all of my colleagues who, like me, are also not interested in denying their constituents the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for broadband infrastructure funding to support my amendment that strikes this language. Because again, let's be clear, a vote for the majority's package with this harmful language in Section 402 is a vote against your state receiving BEAD dollars in a timely and efficient manner. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge a yes vote on my amendment, and I yield back.
I thank you. I thank the gentleman yields back. Are there any members wishing to speak on the gentleman's amendment? The gentleman from Ohio seeks recognition. Why does the gentleman seek recognition?
Speaking in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized to speak on the amendment for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Chairman, Infrastructure and Investments and Jobs Act provided record funding for broadband programs for the purpose of closing the digital divide. Deploying broadband infrastructure and awarding these funds will take cooperation from all the levels of government. We all know that the vast majority of state and local governments do a great job at processing permit requests in a timely manner and do not use the process as a means to extract extra revenues, but the fact of this matter is that some do. The bottom line is, under Mr. Carter's amendment, state and local governments would retain the ability to charge fees for reviewing permitting applications. The only difference here is that we would require those fees to be based on a direct cost, and they would need to be transparent. This ensures that local governments can't be bad actors and increase the cost of an application to subsidize contractors of the local government's choosing. In fact, even the Biden administration agrees with this. In their Notice of Funding Opportunity, NETA asked states to look at the ways to cap their fees. Requiring cost-based and transparent fees will ensure that our historic investment is not wasted and meets the goal of connecting every American. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back my remaining time.
Will the gentleman yield his time? Here.
Yes, I yield my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike last word. I want to reiterate the importance of this Bill 3291 as amended by Mr. Carter. I'd like to start by thanking the Chair for his leadership in this role, and the work we're doing is critically important to turbocharge public and private investment to promote and upgrade infrastructure and boost American competitiveness. Streamlining the permitting process is critically important. The urgency with which we come to the aid of our communities when devastating disasters occur is especially important. My friend and colleague, Mr. Bilirakis, has introduced H.R. 3301, the Connecting Communities Post-Disasters Act. And my bill's been incorporated into Mr. Carter's amendment as well, the 3291. This bill would slash burdensome requirements in order to accelerate replacing and improving communications facilities that were damaged following presidentially declared disasters. And we're all aware of Stafford Act. Disasters address catastrophic events that include hurricanes, tornadoes, and the like. They must rise to the level of warranting federal aid by the direction of the president. As an example, we have Hurricane Michael, a storm that devastated the Florida Panhandle in Georgia. It left a lot of my counties with no communications for up to 2 weeks. There are few things worse than being unable to check on your loved ones following a disaster. One of my biggest takeaways from Hurricane Michael is the burdensome regulations that stood in the way of rebuilding our communications infrastructure. Our bill has been incorporated into this package to ensure that all of our constituents have a streamlined process to rebuild critical communications infrastructure following a devastating natural disaster. I encourage all of my colleagues to support Mr. Carter's bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Ohio yields back the balance of his time. Are there any other members wishing to speak on the gentleman from Texas amendment? Hearing none. Roll call has been requested. The clerk will take the roll.
Bilirakis. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes no. Carter. Carter votes no. Dunn. Dunn votes no. Curtis. Curtis votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Weber votes no. Allen. Allen. Allen votes no. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes no. Kamick. Kamick votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Latta.
No.
Latta votes no. Matsui.
Aye.
Matsui votes aye. Clark. Clark votes aye. VC. VC votes aye. Soto. Soto votes aye. Ashu. Ashu votes aye. Cardenas. Cardenas votes aye. Craig. Craig votes aye. Fletcher. Fletcher votes aye. Dingell. Dingell votes aye. Custer. Custer votes aye. Kelly. Kelly votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis is not recorded. Bilirakis votes no.
Are there any other members wishing to record their vote on the amendment? Hearing none, the clerk will take the roll.
Chair Latta, on that vote, we have 12 ayes and 16 noes.
Well, thank you. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? The ranking member, the gentlelady from California, is recognized for 5 minutes. And why does the gentlelady seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
It's Amendment 01.
To clarify, it's SC_amendment_01?
Yes.
Thank you. Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3291 offered by Ms. Matsui. Page 84, line 18.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering this amendment today to make a clarification that I think all of the members of the subcommittee can agree upon in principle, which is that any unobligated funding remaining in the Trusted Communications Network's reimbursement program shall remain available to rip and replace Chinese gear from our networks. While I understand the desire to repurpose certain unspent funds, I'm worried that a blanket rescission would undermine FCC efforts that are essential to national security. This isn't an abstract concern. According to the FCC itself, there are unobligated funds in the program that could be jeopardized by this bill. That shouldn't be the case, and this amendment will help. I was an original co-sponsor of the Rip and Replace bill that Congress passed and funded on a bipartisan basis. We achieved success with that bill because members in both parties recognize that allowing Chinese network gear to handle our healthcare, financial, and personal data is simply unacceptable. This gear is disproportionately deployed in rural networks. I, for one, do not think we should be putting rip and replace activities in those areas at risk. We made a good down payment on rip and replace, but there's still more to do. All of us on the subcommittee know that we're facing a $3 billion funding shortfall. From the national security threat alone, but especially in light of that funding shortfall, I think it's important to clarify that these funds are protected. This is about keeping funding at the FCC where it's needed most, addressing an immediate national security threat. So, I hope members on the subcommittee will support this amendment. I think it's in line with our bipartisan vision for rip and replace and encourage members to support this. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you very much. The general yields back, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes to speak in opposition to the amendment. The Democrats had ample time to review this legislation. In this Congress, Republicans reached out to discuss this package of bills in February. In April, the subcommittee held a legislative hearing with discussion drafts of each piece of legislation. Unfortunately, Democrats rejected this outreach and declined to work with us on all the bills included in this amendment to include their edits. Well, we'd love to have worked with you on this concern. We only received notice of the amendment just a few hours ago. This amendment is also disappointing because securing our networks is a bipartisan goal that we all share. The Secure and Trusted Communications Network Act established a reimbursement program to remove Huawei, ZTE, and other equipment that poses a threat to our national security. This law was bipartisan, as was the Secure Equipment Act that expanded these prohibitions on untrusted gear to all parts of our communications networks. While we're working hand in glove to fund the shortfall in rip and replace funding, we must also ensure that the replacement of this equipment is done expeditiously. We cannot delay removing this equipment and duplicating environmental reviews for existing infrastructure that could slow down the removal of this national security threat clearly. This amendment could slow down the removal of untrusted Chinese equipment in our networks, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the gentlelady's amendment. Are there any other members wishing to speak on the gentlelady's amendment? Hearing none, the gentlelady has requested a roll call vote. The clerk will take the roll.
Bilirakis. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes no. Carter. Carter votes no. Dunn. Dunn votes no. Curtis. Curtis votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Weber votes no. Allen. Allen votes no. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes no. Kamick. Kamick votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Latta.
No.
Latta votes no. Matsui.
Aye.
Matsui votes aye. Clark. Clark votes aye. Vesey. Soto. Soto votes aye. Eshu. Eshu votes aye. Cardenas. Cardenas votes aye. Craig. Craig votes aye. Fletcher. Fletcher votes aye. Dingell. Dingell votes aye. Custer. Custer votes aye. Kelly. Kelly votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye.
All right.
Mr. Bilirakis is not recorded. Bilirakis votes no.
Are there any other members wishing to record their vote? How's this gentleman from Texas recorded?
Mr. VC is not recorded. VC votes aye.
Are there any other members wishing to record? Hearing none, the clerk will take the roll.
Chair Latta, on that vote, we have 12 ayes and 16 noes.
Thank you very much. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman,
For what reason does the gentlelady seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. It is titled Amend TD4.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3291, offered by Ms. Clark. Page 35, after line 3, insert the following.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
My colleagues on this committee.
The gentlelady is recognized
I'm
for
sorry.
5 minutes to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues, on this committee, we have long recognized that access to reliable, high-speed internet is essential in our increasing digital society. My amendment seeks to balance the benefits of the majority, is attempting to hand out to providers with obligations to ensure that no community or family is left behind when infrastructure is being built. At our legislative hearing on these bills, I referred how efforts to streamline broadband deployment should be balanced with the need to ensure that low-income and minority communities who have been subjected to both traditional and digital redlining in the past do not continue to be left behind. The truth is that many of the communities that were impacted by redlining decades ago, who were discriminated against when seeking to apply for mortgage loans, continue to suffer with inferior infrastructure and services today, including lacking access to affordable and reliable broadband. Unfortunately, our legislative hearing on these bills have heard from experts that previous deregulatory efforts did nothing to mitigate the digital redlining we see today. In fact, deregulation may have made it worse. Instead, previous efforts to, quote, streamline, unquote, simply allowed providers to perpetuate historic discrimination against certain communities while facilitating build-out to wealthier communities where they could make more money. My amendment would ensure that this current round of streamlining doesn't become yet another giveaway to companies seeking to pad their bottom line by not serving low-income and minority communities. Instead, my amendment would allow providers to take advantage of the streamlined processes that the majority is proposing, but only if they commit to serving every household in their jurisdiction that is granting their permit. This will help all communities, as we've seen providers prioritize wealthy and easy to build to neighborhoods in urban, rural, and suburban communities. Without such an obligation, history is doomed to repeat itself, and certain communities will remain disconnected. Therefore, our goals of getting affordable, reliable broadband to every area of this country, goals that my colleagues across the aisle claim to share, will be perpetually frustrated. I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues on this committee to explore pathways to equitably streamline permitting processes and bridge the digital divide. And I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Are there any members wishing to seek recognition, speak on the amendment? The vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Georgia, seeks recognition. Why does this gentleman seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized to strike the last word for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, if the Democrats wanted to have a conversation about serving underserved areas, we would have welcomed it. Unfortunately, this amendment is poorly drafted. The Biden administration continues to move the goalpost on defining what unserved areas mean and it's unclear whether this amendment could itself prohibit the deployment of broadband. Rather than double down on encouraging investment so that all Americans can be served, this amendment could have the opposite effect. This amendment could also lead to less competition in the marketplace if one provider is required to serve all locations, even if another provider could serve some locations more efficiently. This is an unserious amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote no, and I yield back.
Well, thank you. The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the gentlelady's amendment from New York? Hearing none, it's been a roll call vote has been requested by the gentlelady from California, the ranking member. The clerk will call the yeas and nays.
Bilirakis. Bilirakis votes no. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes no. Carter. Carter votes no. Dunn. Dunn votes no. Curtis. Curtis votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Allen. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes no. Kamick. Kamick votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Latta. Latta votes no. Matsui.
Aye.
Matsui votes aye. Clark. Clark votes aye. Vesey. Vesey votes aye. Soto. Soto votes aye. Eshu. Eshu votes aye. Cardenas. Cardenas votes aye. Craig. Fletcher. Fletcher votes aye. Dingell. Dingell votes aye. Custer. Custer votes aye. Kelly. Kelly votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye.
Are there any members wishing to record their vote?
Mr. Allen is not recorded. Allen votes no.
Are there any other members wishing to record their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will take the roll.
We have
Oh, I'm sorry. Is the gentleman from Texas recorded?
Mr. Weber is not recorded. Weber votes no.
And
Ms. Craig is not recorded. Craig votes aye.
last call. Are there any other members wishing to record their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will report the result.
Chair Latta, on that vote, we have 12 ayes and 16 noes.
Thank you. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Why does the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition? Besides a faulty mic?
Have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady has an amendment at the desk.
It's labeled prohibitive transfers, 01.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3291, offered by Ms. Kelly. Page 75, after line 2,
Without
insert the
objection, the
following.
reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to make some clarification provisions of Title II of the AINS, which addresses the cable franchising process. Colleagues, regardless of how much involvement you believe states and localities should have in the sale or transfer of cable franchise, I think we can all agree we would not want these franchises sold to persons that are affiliated with illicit organizations or entities that are deemed a national security threat. In fact, these people should be prohibited from operating anything in this country, including our cable franchises. Allowing individuals such as these to own cable franchises would not only have harmful consequences on those families that rely on these franchises to deliver their cable and broadband services, but it would also violate general American norms and values. My amendment therefore seeks to address this unfortunate oversight by simply amending Section 201 of the AINS to make it clear that cable franchises cannot be transferred to any persons affiliated with organized crime, a terrorist organization, or any entity on the Federal Communications Commission's covered equipment and services list. I would hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle can support this straightforward and common sense amendment, protecting our cable franchises from illegal and dangerous entities who seek to upend our country's security and safety is an issue that should ring true for all of us. For all these reasons, this is my important amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support it. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members seeking recognition to speak on the amendment? The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized. Strike the last word.
Thank you. You know, I think everyone here can agree that we want to be extraordinarily cautious and cognizant and thoughtful. And while this amendment certainly appears that way, there is some vagueness that could ultimately undermine its purpose. Who is to say what is a organized crime or terrorist organization? What is that definition? This amendment does not say, and certainly if there's one thing that we have learned here, it's that we have to be explicit in how we define certain organizations. So certainly, I think we would have loved to have worked with you on addressing this concern on this bill. There has been ample time to review this text. In fact, in April, this subcommittee, we held a legislative hearing with discussion drafts on each piece of legislation, and not a single Democrat raised this concern. So since this has been pending since February, there's been ample time to have these discussions, and unfortunately, it just seems like this outreach was rejected, and ultimately, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle declined to work with us on several of these bills to include their edits. But that aside, I think until we can actually clarify this amendment and work to get those definitions included, we can move forward as is. But happy to work with you on how to address this concern once we've had time to review the language and work through it. And but for now, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. Are there any other members seeking to speak on the gentlelady from Illinois' amendment? Hearing none, it has a roll call has been requested by the gentlelady from California, the ranking member. So the clerk will call the yeas and the nays.
Bilirakis. Bilirakis votes no. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes no. Carter. Carter votes no. Dunn. Dunn votes no. Curtis. Curtis votes no. Joyce. Joyce votes no. Weber. Allen. Allen votes no. Balderson. Balderson votes no. Fulcher. Fulcher votes no. Pfluger. Pfluger votes no. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes no. Kamick. Kamick votes no. Obernolte. Obernolte votes no. Rogers. Rogers votes no. Latta.
No.
Latta votes no. Matsui.
Aye.
Matsui votes aye. Clark. Clark votes aye. Vesey. Vesey votes aye. Soto. Eshu. Cardenas. Cardenas votes aye. Craig. Craig votes aye. Fletcher. Dingell. Dingell votes aye. Custer. Custer votes aye. Kelly. Kelly votes aye. Pallone. Pallone votes aye.
How's the gentleman from Florida recorded?
Mr. Soto votes aye.
Are there other members, the gentlelady from California?
Ms. Eshu is not recorded. Eshu votes aye.
Are there other members wishing to be recorded?
Ms. Fletcher is not recorded. Fletcher votes aye.
Are there any other members wishing to record their vote? Oh, how's the gentleman from Texas recorded?
Mr. Weber is not recorded. Weber votes no.
Are there any other members? Hearing none, the clerk will take the roll.
Chair Latta, on that vote, we have 12 ayes and 16 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Are there any further amendments? Hearing none. At this time, then, is there any further discussion on the Ains? Hearing no further discussion on the Ains, all of those, and I assume you want to record a vote. The gentlelady, the subcommittee ranking member requests a roll call vote. This is on the Ains, and so the clerk will report the yeas and the nays.
Bilirakis. Bilirakis votes aye. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes aye. Carter. Carter votes aye. Dunn. Dunn votes aye. Curtis. Curtis votes aye. Joyce. Joyce votes aye. Weber. Weber votes aye. Allen. Allen votes aye. Balderson. Balderson votes aye. Fulcher. Fulcher votes aye. Pfluger. Pfluger votes aye. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes aye. Kamick. Kamick votes aye. Obernolte. Obernolte votes aye. Rogers. Rogers votes aye. Latta. Latta votes aye. Matsui. Matsui votes no. Clark. Clark votes no. VC. VC votes no. Soto. Eshu. Eshu votes no. Cardenas. Cardenas votes no. Craig. Craig votes no. Fletcher. Fletcher votes no. Dingell. Dingell votes no. Custer. Custer votes no. Kelly. Kelly votes no. Pallone. Pallone votes no.
Are there any other members? How's the gentleman from Florida recorded?
Mr. Soto votes no.
Are there any other members wishing to record their vote?
Chair
Hearing none.
Latta, on that vote, we have 16 ayes and 12 noes.
The Ains amendment is agreed to. And at this time, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3291 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. A roll call vote has been requested. The clerk will take the roll.
Bilirakis. Bilirakis votes aye. Wahlberg. Wahlberg votes aye. Carter. Carter votes aye. Dunn. Dunn votes aye. Curtis. Curtis votes aye. Joyce. Joyce votes aye. Weber. Weber votes aye. Allen. Allen votes aye. Balderson. Balderson votes aye. Fulcher. Fulcher votes aye. Pfluger. Pfluger votes aye. Harshbarger. Harshbarger votes aye. Kamick. Kamick votes aye. Obernolte. Obernolte votes aye. Rogers. Rogers votes aye. Latta.
Aye.
Latta votes aye. Matsui.
No.
Matsui votes no. Clark. Clark votes no. VC. VC votes no. Soto. Soto votes no. Eshu. Eshu votes no. Cardenas. Cardenas votes no. Craig. Craig votes no. Fletcher. Fletcher votes no. Dingell. Dingell votes no. Custer. Custer votes no. Kelly. Kelly votes no. Pallone. Pallone votes no.
Are there any members wishing to record their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will take the roll.
Chair Latta, on that vote, we have 16 ayes and 12 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to as amended. Chair just wants to thank everybody for their attentiveness today, and the subcommittee is adjourned.